Okay, I think we can begin. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, happy Monday, wherever you are. Welcome to the Liberalism Studies program at the George Washington University. My name is Marlene Lauren. I'm the director of the program, and I'm delighted to have you with us today and to receive our dear colleague Stefan Borg, who is associate professor in political science at the Swedish Defense University, and who just released a great book called The Return of the Common Goods, the Postliberal Project, Left and Right. And I really invite you to read the book because it's a very fair, nuanced, balanced overview of the intellectual post-liberal movement, both rightist and leftist, both in the UK and in the US. And he's really trying to look at the scope of that movement from their proposal in political economy, constitutional law, foreign policy, great part section also, we will be discussing that on gender. So it's really, I think, a great way to look at the diversity, but also the unity of the post-liberal kind of thinking and how they have sharp internal disagreements about where to go, but they are sharing the same kind of scope of criticism. So for all those of us who are interested in trying to understand the critics of liberalism and why they are gaining traction today and why they are consequential, it's really a must read for everybody. So, Stefan, thank you for joining us today. I'm really delighted to have you here. I propose to give you the floor so you can do a short presentation of the book, and then I will ask you some questions so we can have a conversation, and then we will open the floor for Q&A, and I will ask the audience to ask their question in the Q&A function. Thank you once again. Welcome, and Stefan, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much for that, Marlene. I've been looking forward to this, actually. The book is called, right, The Return of a Common Good, the Post-Liberal Project, Left and Right. And I wanted to write a sort of a reconstruction and intellectual history of post-liberalism as rigorously and as fairly as I could, that both, kind of post-liberals and liberals would appreciate and actually find fair. So that's what I'm trying to do in this book. It's not a polemical work, and it's an argument, I think, ultimately for taking post-liberal ideas seriously as an intellectual enterprise that does resonate with quite a lot of people. So to start off, some 3 years ago, I wrote an article published in the European Journal of Social Theory, where I kind of argued for a specific interpretation of post-liberalism as a strand of thought. And what I found particularly intriguing and what I wanted to highlight was that this critique was politically ambiguous. It came from a right and from a left. So the book is very much a development of the ideas in that article. So I'm going to start by saying a few words about why I write a book about post-liberalism. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of post-liberalism as I understand it in this book. I'm going to give you a recent definition of post-liberalism as I understand it in this book. And then I'm going to, at the very end, raise some criticism of post-liberalism. First of all, then, why write a book about it? Well, it's of course a widely used label. The label is also understood rather differently. It's been very hard to make sense of what really is post-liberalism. I think it's also fair to say that quite a few contemporary liberals, they have in the early 2020s until now sort of engaged with post-liberalism or key thinkers in this tradition. Also, work on post-liberalism tended to only actually deal with the sort of American US branch and to treat post-liberalism as something wholly on the right of the political spectrum. What's of course also important and worth why it's important, I think, to talk about these ideas, right? That post-liberalism is also a sort of a political project in an important sense. Before I offer a sort of a definition of post-liberalism, I think it would make sense to say a few words about who I think should be included here, because at the end of the day, the book is really deeply inductive in that sense, right? So the post-liberals are essentially a bunch of philosophers, theologians, political and social theorists, as well as public intellectuals. The British branch of post-liberals, they include John Milbank, Adrian Pabst, Maurice Glassman, David Goodhart, Philip Blond, Mary Harrington, and Lewis Perry. The US branch here, I would certainly include Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeulen, Glenn Papin, Chad Pecknell, Michael Lind, Sarah Bachmari, Christine Emba, Erika Bacciocchi, but also somebody like Catherine Liu, actually. And among, shall we say, 20th century thinkers who post-liberals typically draw from, I would include Carl Polanyi, James Burnham, Christopher Lasch, definitely Alasdair MacIntyre, and John Gray. And I think for post-liberalism to be a sort of a meaningful label, it must denote an understanding of liberalism, but has a certain degree of specificity. But that's not to say that there is no overlap between post-liberalism and other strands and our thinking, strands that are critical of liberalism, which is emphatically not the case. There is, of course, a ton of overlap, right? To be sure, Alasdair MacIntyre's critique of liberal modernity, it echoes many of the themes taken up both by British and American post-liberals. There are also, I think, many similarities between the communitarian critics of Rawlsian liberalism in the 80s and 90s and the post-liberals. Michael Sandel, for example, I think he is like a sort of a post-liberal adjacent in many ways. Post-liberals also disagree quite strongly on alternatives to the liberal order. Some post-liberals are on the left, some on the right, and some say that they sort of embrace a radical center. But given all of this diversity, I would still like to argue that there is a certain core to the post-liberal project. And let me just say a few words about the origins of post-liberalism, first in the UK and then in the US. The deeper roots of British post-liberalism lies in a particular Christian theological and philosophical school of thought known as radical orthodoxy, those highly critical of liberal modernity, primarily associated with theologian and philosopher John Milbank, also people such as Catherine Pickstock, Graham Ward, and certainly Adrian Pabst. The most immediate origin of British post-liberalism as a movement lies in the formation of what became known as Blue Labour in 2011. Blue Labour was founded by political theorist Maurice Glassman, an academic, a political theorist actually, Labour life peer in the House of Lords. So those people were highly critical of a market-friendly New Labour championed by Tony Blair and his successor Gordon Brown, and emerged, I would say, in the context of the 2008 financial crisis. So people associated with Blue Labour argued that in the past decades, a corporatist, localist, federal, and institutional form of politics came to be replaced by a liberal and consumerist one that ceased generating the leadership necessary to sustain a democratic movement. Now, when it comes to the United States, and this I think you're very familiar with, but so let me quickly say a few words about this. As you well know, the first election of Trump opened up for an extensive debate on the meaning of conservatism. And I think one could say that there are about at least sort of three strands of post-fusionist conservatism in the United States. National conservatives, the Natcons, right, the West Coast Straussians, and thirdly, the post-liberals. Post-liberalism in the United States, I think it originated mostly within US academia, but some senators also voiced support for post-liberal sounding themes, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, perhaps most notably. So I think Patrick Deneen, Michael Lind, Adrian Vermeulen, Glenn Papin, Chad Pecknold, and Sarah Bachmari would be understood as the most important post-liberal thinkers in the United States. So what then is liberalism about according to the post-liberals? I'm going to give you a very abbreviated account here. But let me first say, and I think this is really key to understand post-liberalism, and that is to say that post-liberals typically approach liberalism both as a political theory, a set of propositions and assumptions about the world that you find in a particular canon of text, such as Hobbes, Locke, Mill, Rawls, and so on. But also, I think very importantly, as a sociopolitical project of ordering societies in specific ways. a worldview that is sort of instantiated in social structures, in institutions, and human practices. And that is very much along the lines of how Alasdair MacIntyre understood liberalism. So what I think what's absolutely key to understand, I think, is the post-liberal understanding of liberalism. Liberalism is, of course, about so many different things, but the core of a liberal project, post-liberals believe, lies a desire to do away with all impediments to the exercise of a human will, to maximize the sphere, the space of individual autonomy. So liberalism, post-liberals typically argue, should first and foremost be understood as a form of philosophical voluntarism, since liberals throughout history, they argue, have prioritized will over other human faculties, such as intellect or emotion. So will is the crucial faculty for liberals. It's ultimately about liberating our will for liberals. That's what post-liberals believe. So the sort of the implication of this then is that all sources that could potentially limit or constrain human autonomy become seen as suspect in some fundamental sense. Community, norms, culture, religion, tradition, family, even modern science, if they suggest constraints on human self-mastery. So, and as far as making a case for post-liberalism as a sort of as a strand of thought, I argue that there are three core components to a post-liberal worldview. The first component or dimension of post-liberalism is an account of change, a dynamic, a sort of macro-historical account of how liberalism in various ways undermines itself. This is, of course, a very sweeping argument to make, right? And there are quite a few different ways of characterizing this erosion. But I think the key, I think, here is that the post-liberal story is that the project of maximizing autonomy, it comes at the expense of attachment, connection, and community. That's at the very, very core of a post-liberal story. So, and even though post-liberals, they typically write of many different macro-historical processes, what they want to emphasize is liberalism as a main engine of some of the dynamics that they explore. All right, so if a first component of a post-liberal project focuses on processes of large-scale historical change, the second component turns to an investigation of a liberal order as a whole, which blends political theory with a much more sociologically oriented mode of analysis. So it's a much more static or structural analysis of liberal order and the social stratification that liberalism produces. More specifically, liberalism is here understood as a kind of ideology critique. Where ideology is, in the words of John Elster, understood as a set of beliefs or values that can be explained through the position of interest of some social group. So the liberal order has generated a particular kind of elite, this argument goes, which primarily works to the perpetuation of its own privileges and to the detriment of working class interests. And for post-liberals, I think it's also fair to say that class belonging is often understood as having less to do with wealth and more to do with a possession of a cultural capital associated with membership of a quintessentially liberal class, what has become known as the professional managerial class, the PMC. So who are the PMCs then? Well, they are the middle-class professionals, college-educated, urban, not the working class, neither the owners of a means of production, right? So post-liberals, at this point, they typically draw from James Burnham and Christopher Lasch. And it should also, of course, be said, right, that the idea of a PMC was coined by thinkers on the left, namely John and Barbara Ehrenreich in the late 1970s. Moreover, a sort of a critique of a liberal order advanced by Lasch has been updated and it has been expanded by contemporary writers that I understand to be post-liberal, since they undertake precisely this form of ideology critique of sort of aimed at the liberal social order. Catherine Liu, in her Virtue Hoarders, Case Against the Professional Managerial Class, and Michael Lind in his The New Class War, they have both advanced projects along these lines. And they see populism as a symptom of and a reaction to the accelerating social and economic liberalism of Western ruling elites. The third component and the final component of a post-liberal synthesis or a post-liberal project is more sort of forward-looking and seeks to address the question, well, what then is to be done about the liberal malaise, which they think is characteristic of Western societies. And to put this in fairly broad and general term, what they believe is that politics should be reoriented from only maximizing individual autonomy, but also or more fully promote the so-called common good. What's the common good ultimately concerned with then? Well, the common good is usually understood to be concerned with somehow realizing human flourishing. And what's very important, I think, to realize here is that there is sort of an objective component to what flourishing means. It's not just what you or me think is kind of what we love to do or what we believe is in our interest. It has a much more objective dimension to it, right? There's of course a lot of criticism that you could make of post-liberalism. Let me just briefly touch on three before I finish the presentation. First of all, do post-liberals, do they so attack a sort of a straw man? I mean, given the sort of a multifaceted character of a liberal tradition, the perhaps most obvious criticism, right, of post-liberalism is that its leading scholars, they have misconstrued liberalism, and post-liberals are therefore attacking kind of a straw man. And I think there is something certainly to be said for this criticism, right? Helena Rosenblatt, some years ago, she wrote a wonderful history called The Lost History of Liberalism, where she emphasizes that virtually all or most, vast majority of liberal thinkers and political practitioners, they were deeply concerned with the common good and how the sort of a narrow pursuit of self-interest kind of undermined the common in some fundamental sense, right? So there has always probably been that dimension to the liberal project too, right? A second sort of fundamental criticism, is it inherently legitimate to refer to a common good? And I think we will probably return to this, to a question about the common good, but I think the common good can be given a very sort of soft interpretation, where it's more along the lines of proposals that the vast majority of people would kind of think is good, such as strengthening trade unions and strengthening the sort of intermediate bodies between the state and the individual in some ways, trying to give ordinary people a voice in their own government in some fundamental sense, about subsidiarity, right? On the other hand, it can also take a very, I would say, sinister and authoritarian direction, where and this I think is I think you can find this, and I'm not trying to be unfair to anybody, but I think within Adrian Vermeule's project, Common Good Constitutionalism, I think that there is that you can quite clearly see that, basically, that the state is tasked with the sort of the imposition of the common good upon a political body, right? A third question can be asked perhaps along the lines of, is it possible to regenerate the social states and corresponding set of practices that post-liberals believe that liberalism has eroded? And this is a kind of a pointed critique that you can make of all forms of communitarian thinking, I think. So I think one may seriously doubt whether the enabling conditions for flourishing local communities, for democratic virtues and solidarity were cultivated, may ever really be resurrected through political means again. And I think I will actually end my presentation here. So I'm gonna end this here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, Stefan, for great introduction to the book and a lot of fascinating things that we have some time to discuss. So maybe let me begin with a series of questions before we turn the floor to the audience. My first question would be, because you are treating post-liberalism really as a kind of coherent tradition, even if it has different kind of political project, how would you put it in the kind of intellectual genealogy of, anti-liberalism, or how would you articulate what is new and what is just an adaptation of known critiques, but to the kind of contemporary element? So how would you describe the kind of intellectual genealogy of the movement with what has existed before, and also the more kind of illiberal critique of liberalism that we see emerging? And because in your book you have really a discussion a bit about what is post-liberal, what is illiberalism, and at which moment they may intersect. So if you could develop on that.
That's an excellent it's an excellent question, Marlene, and I'm not sure I can really do it justice, but I'll try to offer at least some thoughts. I mean, I think most fundamentally, I think that many post-liberals, and particularly post-liberals on the left, they do not think of their project as illiberal, as anti-liberal. And they reject, the genealogy of illiberalism, which is, of course, deeply, deeply reactionary, right? So for them, I think it's more about trying to sort of to recover. I will actually put it this way. I think at its core, for the British post-liberals and some American post-liberals, it is a sort of rejuvenated, somewhat updated form of communitarianism, I think. But it can also be taken in a very illiberal direction, particularly in the project of Adrian Vermeule, who is essentially a Schmittian, right? I mean, it's not at all a Burkean conservative or working in that intellectual environment of Tocqueville and so on and so forth. I think that project is really quite distinct, right? And I think it's also perhaps important to say something about Patrick Deneen's project, because I think in regime change, the follow-up to why liberalism failed, there are sort of two voices, I think, in that book. One is the sort of more moderate Burkean conservative, that seeks to strengthen and rejuvenate local communities that have been eroded and so on and so forth. But there's also, this much more illiberal dimension of his argument too. So it's like kind of, I think there is a sort of a fundamental tension here, right? But I think it's when it comes to liberalism, I think it's also perhaps important for me to say that I don't think it should be understood in the genealogy of nationalist thinking, because and that's also why I find it more interesting in a sense, right? Because nationalism we know a lot about nationalism. And nationalists have always tended to sort of to blame an outsider, something on the outside, for all the social ills and so on, right? Whereas the post-liberals at their core, they rather blame something deeply inherent to the sort of Western tradition itself in some ways, right? So those are just some initial reflections on that question.
I think you brought really key element, especially the relationship to nationalism. And maybe one more question on the relationship to another concept, which is the one of populism, because when they are critical of the professional managerial class, which I think is really one of the core elements and one that resonates probably the most, how much the project in that case is about reinventing who are the elites, right? And in that case, how much is that rejoining some of the kind of populist critique about the elites are the core of the problems, and how much is that calling for changing, maybe sometimes reversing the kind of symbolic hierarchy between the professional managerial class and the more kind of, I don't know, blue collar, maybe a part of the society. So if you could develop on that, and maybe that speaks more to the leftist interpretation of postliberalism than to the rightist one.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you that that a very important dimension of sort of a post-liberal project is really the critique of a professional managerial class, right? And this is, very in some sense kind of very Marxian sounding, so in a way, right? But I also think that one of the biggest problems here is that the PMC of a professional managerial class in the post-liberal sort of telling becomes just incredibly broad, basically, right? That it's like it kind of includes pretty much anybody who is involved, with sort of managing, the system and making sure that it works, even on the margins and so on and so forth, right? So it's a very sort of blunt categorization in a sense of society, right? But I think it does really, it really does speak to the sort of to this an overlap between sort of strands of thinking that kind of points to something very conservative, but also strands of thinking that points to something quite revolutionary in some ways, right? And that's what I think is, at the end of the day, perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of a post-liberal project, the way that I understand it.
Yeah, great point. And maybe linking to that, something you didn't mention in your presentation, but which is really important in your book, it's the place of gender theory in the kind of post-liberal critique of liberalism. So if you could develop on that, because I think it's really bringing an interesting light in trying to think about gender debates as a kind of becoming a key representative of liberal thought, and therefore the post-liberal thinking has also to kind of be thinking deeply about what do they mean by that and how they would like to see the gender or the broadly also the family related issues to be rearticulated in whatever post-liberalism would propose to do.
Yes, no, I think that's and also an excellent question and something I've been sort of trying to think about, because I think post-liberalism it appears in different domains that I've been trying to sort of tease out in my book, and one domain is the domain of gender relations, and here and I think first of all I think sort of post-liberal feminists, I think they have to be understood against the background of a Me Too movement, basically, which I think caused a lot of people to go back or to look back at the second wave feminists, Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, who were very concerned with questions, such as pornography and sex and so on. And Andrea Dworkin was often, I believe, unfairly or not, right, understood to be sort of very negative towards sex. So the third wave of feminists, they tended to take much more of a positive, sex positive sort of stance on these issues. And post-liberal feminists, and I think here the two key books, or three key books actually. One is certainly The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry. She talks about post-liberalism. I think she kind of sees herself as a post-liberal. She basically believes that what she's targeting is a kind of liberal feminist that sort of wants to reduce sex to a commodity as any other commodity that is to be treated in very, very transactional terms in a sense, right? And also this idea then that, well, as long as consent is in place, well, everything is fine in some fundamental sense. And what post-liberal feminists such as Louise Perry and also Christine Emba in her in a somewhat similar book basically argued that the focus on consent that tends to obscure all kinds of gendered inequities in relations between men and women. And what also, I think what's also kind of interesting here when it comes to the gender dimension of it is that I think, in the reception history of these books, I would say that many reviewers, they were really quite sympathetic to the diagnostic part of these books, basically saying, well, there is, some like a liberal feminist that has been almost fully appropriated by the logic of a market in a sense, right? But the solutions were much more sort of controversial and also kind of hard to grapple with in some ways, right? But I think an important part of a post-liberal feminist project, was to take a much more skeptical stance towards sort of sex positivity, understood as something that had been sort of captured by the market. Processes of commodification in general.
And maybe one element that you don't have a specific chapter on that in the book, but it's like a little bit everywhere as part of the discussion of the post-liberal interpretation of the common goods, is the place that environmental issues plays or do not plays sometime in the debates. I mean, how can we reinventing a common goods that is not somehow in relationship with changing our view of nature? And so some post-liberal seems really interested in that issue. Some seems to have a kind of silent position on that. So could you a little bit develop also on that aspect? Because I think it's a big difference maybe between some of the different trends, the leftist one being maybe more interested by environmental issue, the right wing having a very old-fashioned understanding of what is nature, what is culture. So that's also, I think, an important element of the debate.
No, definitely. I think you're exactly right that the environment is really key to this, because the sort of in the post-liberal sort of master narrative, it's basically the story of how the sort of a more and more aggressive individualist takes over, which also kind of entails a sort of an attitude of trying to master nature for our own ends, and whatever we want to do with it, we should be able to do with it. It's ours, god damn it, in a way, right? That's it might be and of course it might be a straw man, right? But I think that is sort of the sort of the post-liberal critique of liberalism in relation to to promoting this attitude of mastery over nature. Take whatever you want, take whatever we want. It's just in our service, in a sense, right? And I think you're also right that yes, I mean some post-liberals are, like somebody like Adrian Pabst, I think it's a very important dimension of his project, and also the project that he's been kind of developing with John Milbank. I mean, a sort of an ecological green dimension of post-liberalism, right? Whereas other post-liberalists like integralists, for example, I'm not sure. I don't think they write about it as much at all, right? But it's certainly a very important dimension to it. I think you're entirely right.
Wonderful. And maybe one more question, and then we will open the floor for the Q&A. So please ask your question in the Q&A chat. So this post-liberalism is developing across multiple fields, right? Going from political theory, theology, international relations, jurisprudence, gender theory, where do you think it make the strongest argument and the one where probably it will have a kind of long-lasting impact, even if it may not be formulated as post-liberalism, but in that institutional reform, the moral critique, the reading of the international scene, where do you see the kind of the most acute kind of element of the debates?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question, Marlene. And let me start with, a sort of a brief point about that. And because in some ways, I thought that the sort of the post-liberal section of a new right in the United States, I think they have been very opposed to American interventionism and sort of American expansionism. And actually, I would say that virtually all parts of a post-fusionist new right in the United States have been very sort of skeptical. They wanted to get away from it, never-ending wars and all of that kind of stuff, right? But I mean, so I was, I think a lot of people thought, oh, well, maybe that's going to have some sort of impact then on what's happening in the United States and in terms of the, current administration, right? But that's absolutely not the case, right? It's just the opposite. We are seeing a highly interventionist, and expansionist American foreign policy, right? So if post-liberal ideas, coming from the right, fairly close to the power or whatever in the United States, well, in that field, they seem to have had absolutely no effect whatsoever, right? But what I would perhaps think and would, because I do think that we might see the return of sort of a inclusive, broad-based social democracy in Europe, actually, as a response, to far-right populism and so on. And I think that kind of social democracy, how they align, with post-liberalism is this sort of really quite fundamental critique of a logic of a market, how the market society has taken over more and more and more domains of our worlds in some ways, right? And what we can do collectively to try to stem that thinking and that, kind of mode of operating in the world. And so, maybe there is, and actually, to be honest with you, when somebody like Mamdani talks about collectivists, the warmth of collectivists, I think he really points towards, to some sort of return to the common good. He, of course, uses a different frame of reference and so on, right? But I think it's a sort of a fatigue with this deeply transactional, individualism, which is maybe has run its course in some ways, right? Back to something more communal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably a shared feeling among many people interested in that topic. So yeah, thank you so much, Stefan. Maybe let's move now to the question, and we have at least 5, and we may have some other joining. So maybe let's begin with the question from our colleague Laura Field, who said that thank you for the book, very excited to read it, especially for understanding the differences between the US and the UK version. One thing that the post-liberals tend to undervalue is civil rights and the idea that government must be limited in its willfulness. Can you speak to how the UK post-liberals understand that problem, and do they hold on to basic political rights more than the Americans?
Okay, so first of all, Laura, thank you for your question. And your book just received. I just received your book actually, and I'm very much looking forward to Furious Minds. It's called. I very much look forward to reading that. I've read your writings. I'm very happy you're here today. I think your writing is excellent. When it comes to civil rights and the British post-liberals, well, I think that British post-liberals, in my understanding, I think they should be understood as, fairly old-fashioned, fairly conservative social democrats in some ways, right? So I think they would take very strong exception, to limiting or undermining, civil rights or rights in any way, shape, or form. I don't think that is their project, actually. And similarly, in Sweden, there are also actually interest, within circles of sort of intellectual parts of the social democratic movement, they are also sort of interested in some sort of a more leftist post-liberalism. But for them, I think it's absolutely not about limiting rights or anything like that. That's not how I understand it, at least.
Thank you. Maybe another question from our colleague Elena Rosenblatt, who said, thank you for a wonderful presentation. You spoke of post-liberalism's relationship to nationalism, and Marlene asked about its relationship to populism. What would you say about post-liberalism's relationship to Catholicism?
Yes, excellent. And Lynn, I'm very happy you're here. And as I said, I love your book. I think it's been, well, you have written many books, but The Lost History of Liberalism, I think, has been very, very influential. So the question was about the relation between liberalism and, can you repeat the question, Marlene, please?
Between the relationship of post-liberalism to Catholicism.
Exactly. Yes. So I think that there is a sort of a certainly a deep relation here, right? Because I think most of the American post-liberals, with the exception of somebody like Michael Lind and also the left-leaning people like Catherine Liu, but the core of American post-liberals, they are Catholic, essentially, right? And I think I think that's kind of important in some ways, because I think it's important for understanding why post-liberalism is not even in its most conservative instantiations a form of nationalism, because of this deep incompatibility between Catholicism and nationalism. It's much more sort of universalist in orientation than, for example, the NatCons, the National Conservatives, and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to the British post-liberals, I mean, Adrian Pabst, who is one of the leading thinkers, I mean, he's certainly a Catholic, right? But what he wants to do in his writings, and what he writes with John Milbank, is basically to not to develop a project that is exclusive to believers, Catholics, Christians, or whatnot. I think he's inspired by Catholic social teaching. I think a lot of the British post-liberals are deeply inspired by Catholic social teaching, but they don't want to limit the project, to religious people. I think they draw on this inheritance, on this heritage, but they don't want to limit it to that. I think.
Mm-hmm. And now we have two questions that I will put together because they are both on the definition of the common good. So one from Saif, one from Jennifer. Saif is asking if you could elaborate on the post-liberal understanding of the common goods and how it differs from the classical Republican understanding of civic virtues, and whether it's a return to the communitarian debates of the late 80s and 90s. And Jennifer also asking you to elaborate on the definition of the common goods. You mentioned Vermeule's, for example, authoritarian state imposition of an objective view. So what are the non-authoritarian versions to arrive at common goods?
Okay, great. Yes. those are
questions. If you have the answer, you are kind of politically important.
Yes, exactly. And I certainly don't have the answers, but I will try to offer some reflections here. But in some ways, I think the tradition of the common good, right, that kind of starts with Aristotle, and it's sort of commonsensical within in ancient political theory, and even like medieval political theory too, that politics is really about trying to make people flourish. It's about substantive goods. It's not just sort of an instrumental understanding of politics. And I think it is, but I think the problem with the common good tradition is that it has always been really quite vague. And how are we to think about the common good in contemporary, deeply pluralistic societies, right? I mean, so I think one can contrast in my chapter on it. I try to sort of to compare like three ways of thinking about the common good. And we can, one way is definitely to think about it in terms of Catholic integralism. And that is really, I think about the sort of a top-down imposition of certain defined substantive goods upon a population, right? And I think that's it's very it's difficult to see how that would ever kind of work or resonate, or and I think it has very sort of authoritarian undertones to it, right? Then a second way to think about the realization of a common good is, I think, what we find in Patrick Deneen's writings. Because, as you remember, right, in Why Liberalism Failed, his book from 2018, he mainly talks about, he sounds very communitarian, when he talks about alternatives to the liberal order. Well, what should we do? We should perhaps, people should get together. We should live, in areas, and they should try to form, communities which are perhaps more about practicing social virtues and becoming fully human in that sense, and taking part in their own government and so on and so forth, right? But then in regime change, he moves, right, to a sort of at least halfway, or as I said, I think there are sort of two voices in regime change. One, which is very sort of Burkean, which has this understanding of culture and the common good as something that comes from a bottom up, in a sense, right? It's not something that's imposed by anybody. It's really sort of, it puts its faith in the common sense of ordinary people, and the sort of a decency of ordinary people, that in social interaction we will become more fully human, in a sense, right? We will, but at the same time, there's also, of course, in regime change, this sort of also, something that points to a more authoritarian, project in line with Vermeule's project, right? But the third way to think about the common good is, I think, the one that you find in the writings of Adrian Pabst, and some of the writings also with Michael Lind. I think you find something quite similar, but that is a way to organize. I think it's about trying to organize societies in ways that makes sort of that pushes back at a sort of a centralized state as sort of having sort of too much power, and also against the market, and to support the intermediary institutions between the individual and the state / the market, in a way. That institutional arrangements that sort of disperse power, I think, and that sort of enables a sort of self-governing communities in different ways, right? And such sort of settings would be more conducive to exercising social virtues, which Pabst believes are really quite universal. We are inscribed in our natures as social beings, We are like compassionate people. We are oriented to justice. We are essentially very decent, right? But we need venues where we can practice that, right? Where we can develop sort of solidarity with others. I think that's, broadly speaking, what this project is sort of gesturing at, right?
Another question more about politics, this time from Eric. How much do you observe that politicians in the UK and US overtly embrace a critique of liberalism and therefore some kind of post-liberal position, rather than saying that they still support liberalism, but in fact are espousing anti-liberal views?
Yeah, I that's a good question too. I mean, I'm not sure. I think actually probably all of you are probably better at responding to the question about the American state of the US American politics right now. I would say, if I perhaps were to say something, it would be to say that it's among the sort of the sections of the new right in the United States. It always struck me as the sort of the NatCons and the West Coast Straussians were the most sort of influential and powerful. West Coast Straussians have always been at their core sort of culture warriors, right? And whereas the NatCons, I mean, sort of, I think the nationalism is an incredibly powerful ideology, I think, and which is, I think, deeply tragic, right? But I think this sort of more communitarian version of post-liberalism, I really don't think that it is that, that particularly influential. It doesn't seem to me that way, at least, right?
Another question from Laura again. Could you speak more about how networked the various post-liberal groups are, and how much do they speak to one another or argue it out together, or are they kind of ignoring each other?
No, that's also a great question, right, Laura, because I think that I think that there was it's very I think it's because in terms of philosophy, right, there's sort of an abstract critique of liberalism, you can find quite a lot of common ground, right? But when it comes to what is to be done, the sort of the politics that's supposed to follow from this, right? I think that there is quite a serious division, between the British post-liberals who are, not at all fans of Hungary and, Orban's, attempt to instantiate some sort of illiberal democracy or something like that. Whereas American post-liberals, somebody like Gladys Papin, for example, right, who works in Hungary right now, I mean, they are much more sort of positive and supportive of such a project, right? Which is, I think, to British post-liberals would be understood as deeply illiberal, not post-liberal, but really actually illiberal. So I think that there's quite a bit of political tension here, right? And that's. But I mean, at the same time, right, I think it's also very interesting. Something that I thought about a lot, Laura, was, that you saw the sort of a proliferation of what I think are, broadly speaking, post-liberal, magazines such as American Affairs, such as Compact Magazine, such as Unheard. And they are still, you find quite a lot of diversity in terms of the people who actually write for those venues, right? And I think that's actually, to be honest, I think that's probably a good thing, right? Because I think we probably need more debate, from, quite starkly different positions and venues where people can actually sort of, write and, debate in and so on and so forth. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
Great, then we have time for one more question from Aaron about asking you about how post-liberalism relates to time and the philosophy and politics of time. How do they relate to tradition, to heritage, but also to the future? And so following in one of kind of Elena's question, is that a sense of kind of Christian times and perhaps even a kind of eschatological dimension of something else? I think the time question, because you have the post-liberalism. So what is the place of time in that debate? Is that also post-liberalism, pre-liberalism? How do you think about kind of projecting political imaginary in the future or reinventing tradition, nostalgia? So how do you think time is playing a role in that current debates? Because all that comes from like the end of history, also narrative, right? And backlashing against the idea that history is over. So when we reopen history, what is the place of time and thinking the times in that debate?
Yeah, okay, great. Wonderful question as well, right? I mean, so in some sense, right, I think that you will find a sort of a backwards looking kind of nostalgia in a lot of post-liberal writing on the right, certainly, but also I would say on the left, before the sort of the neoliberal project and finance capitalism and so on, took over. So I think there is a sort of a nostalgia here to go back in time, right? And those projects are, of course, always open, to the charge of, but, I mean, sort of the communities, local communities and so on that you seem to be very fond of, weren't they really quite oppressive of women? Weren't they quite oppressive of different minorities and so on and so forth, right? It's a very similar critique that's always been directed at communitarian thinking, right? Which is, of course, there's a lot to that, of course. I mean, it's important, right? But I think especially leftist post-liberals, they would of course say, well, but those are not the communities that we want to go back to. No, we want to look forward. We want to build something much, much more inclusive, but also something that gives much greater voice, to ordinary people in their own government and so on and so forth, right? But I mean, when it comes to the theme of time, right? Because I think in this sort of Burkean, conservatism, because when Burke talked about the sort of a social contract, his great critique, of the social contract tradition was to say, well, but we have to think about the contract that includes past generations, the present generation, and future generations in some fundamental sense, right? And I think you find that, which, in a sort of in its beneficial dimensions, right? That's much more conducive to projects of environmental preservation and, to care for the environment and so on and so forth, coming generations, right? And so on. So I think you find also that that understanding of of time as not. I think they think, or some would, I think that liberalism is very present. It's about the present. It's about maximizing satisfaction and desires for people living here and now at their fullest. Don't let anybody stop them, because that's paternalism, right? And that always tends to some form of illiberal paternalism or something like that, right? But those are just some scattered thoughts. But thank you. It's a question that deserved a much better answer than I could give to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think the way you answer is also, it's really bringing a lot into the discussion. So I think because it's time for us already to conclude, I think the book really kind of is a great contribution to the current debates, and the fact that you are looking at both the different versions, both in their diversity, but also in what they make them being coherent. And the way you look at some of these really specific debate that haven't been so much kind of connected, like the gender one, I think it's really a great contribution to the global discussion. So thank you again, Stefan, for being with us today and for having published the book. I invite everybody here to really read the book. We will be publishing the kind of revised transcript of our discussion on our website, so you will be able also to read it and to circulate it. So once again, thank you, everybody. And Stefan, congratulations again to you, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. Wonderful, wonderful questions. It was really, really fun, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.